Put her down. Marcus Hargrove barked into the microphone, pointing straight at the man holding his unconscious wife. The ballroom froze. 100 of the most powerful people in the city stood in their tuxedos and evening gowns, champagne glasses suspended halfway to their lips, conversations dying mid-sentence, every pair of eyes locked on the same impossible scene. A man none of them had expected was kneeling on the marble floor beside a ruined three-tiered cake, lifting Elena Hargrove into his arms, as though she weighed nothing at all. As though carrying an unconscious woman out of a charity gala in front of 100 cameras was the most natural thing in the world. Dominic Ashford stood slowly. Elena's dark hair fell back from her face. Her emerald dress draped across his arms like something ceremonial, catching the chandelier light in fractured patterns of green and gold. Her head rested against his shoulder with the complete surrendered weight of someone who had finally stopped holding themselves upright. Marcus came around the head table. His face had gone a deep mottled red beneath the crystal light. The white boutonniere on his lapel trembled with the force of his breathing. His finger leveled across the distance between them like an accusation given physical form. I said, put her down. Who the hell do you think you are? Dominic turned to face him. Not quickly, not with the theatrical slowness of a man performing composure. He simply turned the way water changes direction when it meets stone, without an effort, without announcement, following a path that had already been decided long before this moment arrived. When he spoke, his voice was low, not raised, not cold in any manufactured sense, just quiet in the way that certain forces were quiet, with the absolute certainty of something that did not require volume to be understood. Get away from her before you regret it. 7 words. And every person in that ballroom realized simultaneously that the man holding the politician's wife was not a guest who had wandered in from a different event, was not a bodyguard or someone's plus one. The name moved through the room in whispers that carried the particular weight of recognition. Dominic Ashford. A journalist lowered her phone. A senator took a visible step backward. 2 federal prosecutors stationed near the bar exchanged a look that contained an entire unspoken conversation. Because everyone in this city knew that name, and nobody who knew it argued with the man who carried it. Not twice. It had not started here. It had started 4 months earlier in a dimly lit bar at the edge of the financial district with a woman in an emerald dress, a glass of whiskey she had not touched, and a man who made the quiet, consequential mistake of noticing her. The bar was called Lantern. No sign on the door. No website, no social media presence. The kind of establishment that existed specifically for people who needed to disappear for a few hours without actually going anywhere. Low amber lighting, leather booths set deep into shadowed alcoves, a bartender who refilled glasses without making eye contact and understood without discussion that whatever brought you through that unmarked door tonight was your business and nobody else's. It was not a place for loud music or crowds 3 deep at the rail. It was a place for sitting alone with something you could not put down, a thought, a memory, a bruise you had not yet decided how to explain, and being surrounded by other people doing exactly the same thing without any of you ever having to acknowledge it. Elena Hargrove had been coming to Lantern for 7 weeks, always on a Tuesday, always after 11, always dressed in something that suggested she had come from somewhere important. A dinner, a fundraiser, one of the endless functions that filled the calendar of a political wife whose husband required her attendance the way a stage required its props. Tonight it was a deep emerald wrap dress, delicate gold earrings, dark hair pinned loosely at the nape of her neck. She sat at the far end of the bar with a glass of Jameson she spent more time studying than drinking, turning it slowly between her fingers, watching the amber liquid catch the low light as though it contained something she was trying to read. Her wedding ring caught the light every time she moved her hand. A large, brilliant stone, the kind of ring chosen to be noticed to communicate something about the man who gave it rather than the woman who wore it. She twisted it absently, a nervous habit she probably did not know she had. From across the room, she looked like exactly what Marcus Hargrove needed her to look like. Elegant, composed. The kind of woman other men envied and other women studied, trying to identify the formula. Up close, her hands were trembling. Dominic Ashford noticed the trembling the first night. He sat at a corner table, his table the one the staff knew better than to offer anyone else with a glass of still water and nothing else. He was not there to drink. He was rarely anywhere for the reasons other people assumed. He came to Lantern 3 nights a week out of habit, out of the comfort of familiar walls, out of a preference for quiet that had become over the decades something closer to a requirement than a choice. He was not a man who drew attention to himself. This was remarkable given that attention was the one thing he could never entirely avoid. Tall, dark suit, black shirt, buttoned to the collar without a tie. The tattoos on his neck climbed above the fabric in dark, precise lines that other men in rooms like this sometimes wore as decoration, but on Dominic looked like documentation. A record of a life lived along a particular edge, written in ink that could not be erased or explained away. His face gave almost nothing. Not cold exactly, contained, economical. The face of a man who had learned decades ago that most expressions were a form of vulnerability and who had built an empire on the principle that what you withheld was always worth more than what you revealed. He noticed the woman at the bar the way he noticed everything, without appearing to. She came back the following Tuesday, same seat, same whiskey, same ring, catching the amber light, and bruises on her left wrist that her gold bracelet almost concealed. The bracelet was wide, deliberately chosen, positioned with the specific care of someone who had learned exactly how much jewelry was required to hide what lay beneath it. Dominic said nothing. He watched and he said nothing because it was not his place and because he understood better than most people that unsolicited attention from a stranger, especially a stranger who looked like him, was rarely comforting to a woman sitting alone at a bar with wounds she had not been asked to explain. So he watched, and he waited, and he kept coming back on Tuesdays. The third week she had a shadow along her jaw that her foundation had not fully concealed. She sat with her back slightly angled toward the room protecting something. Her left arm moved carefully, held close to her body, in a way that suggested pain in the ribs or the shoulder, the kind of stiffness that came from being grabbed or struck in a place that clothing covered completely. She drank faster that night, left earlier, kept checking her phone with the specific tension of someone waiting for a message they were afraid to receive. The fourth week, she cried in the bathroom for 12 minutes. Dominic knew because he counted. Not obsessively, not with conscious intention, but with the automatic precision of a man whose survival had always depended on tracking the duration of things. 12 minutes between when she left her stool and when she returned, eyes slightly redder, lipstick freshly applied expression, carefully reconstructed into something neutral. She was extraordinarily good at reconstructing her expression. It was the kind of skill that only developed through years of practice, through years of needing to. The fifth week, she looked like she had not slept in days. The emerald dress was replaced by something darker, long-sleeved, despite the warmth of the bar, and her movements had acquired a new quality of deliberateness, as though every gesture required conscious authorization from a body that had begun to ration its cooperation. She ordered her whiskey, did not drink it, stared at the ring on her finger for a long time with an expression that was not quite sadness and not quite anger, but something between the two that had no name. The expression of someone contemplating the symbol of a contract they had signed without understanding the terms. The sixth week she was worse, not physically, not in ways the bar could see. The bruises were better hidden this time, but something had changed in her eyes, a particular quality of exhaustion that Dominic recognized because he had seen it before in other people, in other decades in rooms much darker than this one. It was the exhaustion of a person who had spent so long surviving that they had forgotten what it felt like to simply live, who had been load-bearing for so long that the structure itself had begun to fail quietly from the inside in places no one could see until the collapse. She sat with her shoulders caved inward. She did not twist the ring tonight. She just stared at it, like she was trying to remember how she had arrived at this particular bar, in this particular life, wearing this particular stone on her finger that was supposed to mean love, and had come to mean something so different that the original definition had been erased entirely. She lifted the whiskey glass, set it back down without drinking, lifted it again, then pressed the back of her hand to her mouth, a small, involuntary gesture, and Dominic understood, without needing to be told, that she was 3 seconds from breaking apart in a room full of strangers. He was already standing before the thought finished forming. He crossed the bar quietly, not quickly, not with urgency, and stopped at the exit just as she reached for her coat. She looked up at him, dark eyes exhausted, the kind of dark that absorbed light rather than reflected it. He spoke before she could. Someone is hurting you. Not a question, not an accusation. A fact stated plainly by a man with pale eyes and neck tattoos who somehow managed to make the truth sound like the gentlest thing anyone had said to her in years. Elena Hargrove's carefully reconstructed expression cracked straight down the middle. She did not cry. Not immediately. That was not how it worked for women like Elena. Women who had spent years learning to swallow things. Grief, fear, pain, humiliation before they reached the surface. Crying was a luxury she had been trained out of slowly and methodically, the way Marcus did everything. Not with shouting, not at first. With silence. With the particular coldness of a man who withheld warmth the way a landlord withheld heat in winter. Strategically. Deliberately. Until you were willing to do almost anything just to feel warm again. So she did not cry. She straightened, pulled her coat tighter across her shoulders, and looked at Dominic with the careful measuring expression she used on everyone who got too close. "You don't know anything about me," she said. Her voice was flat, deliberate. She held up her left hand so the ring caught the light. A reflex, a shield she had deployed so many times it required no thought. "I know," Dominic said. "I'm not asking you anything." She stared at him for a long moment, searching his face for the angle, the thing beneath the thing, because there was always a thing beneath the thing when men spoke to her. That was her experience. That was what her life had taught her. She found nothing she could name, which made her more uncomfortable than if she had. "Then what are you doing?" "Standing here," he said. "That's all." She turned back toward the door, walked past him without another word. He let her go. He came back the following Tuesday. So did she. It was the 8th week, a cold Tuesday in October, when Elena finally sat down across from Dominic at his corner table. She appeared beside it without warning, hood already on bag over one shoulder, dark hair loose around her face. She looked like she had been standing there for a moment before he noticed her. "Working up to something. Why do you keep coming here?" she asked. "I like the quiet. You watch me. I notice things. It's different." She pulled out the chair, sat down without being invited. A small act of defiance or perhaps a test. Dominic did not react, did not straighten, did not smile. He simply waited the way he always waited, with the particular stillness of someone who had nothing to prove. "What are you?" she asked. The question was oddly direct. Raw. Depends on who you ask. I'm asking you. Someone who pays attention. Lena looked at her hands, the ring, the amber light. She did not twist it tonight. She just looked at it clearly as though seeing it for the first time. "I told you I was married." "You did. I meant it as a warning, not just information." "I understood." Elena studied his face. Then she said something that changed the air between them entirely. "My father was a judge, Raymond Prescott, federal bench 23 years. He taught me everything I know about the law, about justice, about what it means to look at a broken system and decide you are going to fix it anyway, even when the system fights back." She paused. The bar hummed quietly around them. "I was a lawyer, a good one. Constitutional litigation. I won cases that mattered, cases that changed things. My father used to call me after every verdict. Win or lose, he would say the same thing every time. You stood up. That's what counts. You stood up." Her voice had acquired a quality Dominic had not heard before. Not the careful flatness of survival. Something deeper. Something that still burned. He died 2 years ago. Car accident. Single vehicle, late at night on a road he had driven 1,000 times. The police said he lost control. The investigation lasted 11 days. She looked up at Dominic. 11 days for a federal judge. My father had just begun looking into irregularities in the city's commercial zoning legislation. Contracts awarded to shell companies. Public funds redirected through charitable foundations. He told me the week before he died that he was close to something, that the corruption went higher than anyone suspected. Dominic was very still. "Marcus made me leave the law 6 weeks after the funeral. He said I was too fragile, too emotional. He told our friends I was having a breakdown. He had been telling them for months already, I found out later. Building the narrative, the unstable wife, the drinking problem, the poor decisions. By the time I understood what he was doing, the story was already set. Nobody believed me. My own mother stopped returning my calls because Marcus had convinced her I needed space. What he meant was isolation. The word landed between them and sat there. He monitors my phone. He has someone follow me twice a week. He knows I come here. He lets me because he thinks it is pathetic. A sad wife drinking alone. It fits the story he tells about me. Why are you telling me this? Dominic asked. Because you already know something is wrong. And you haven't run. And I am so tired. Her voice fractured on the word. Just slightly. Just enough to reveal the hairline crack that ran through everything she had built to hold herself together. I am so tired of pretending in front of people who can see it anyway. She pressed her lips together, steadied herself, pulled the coat tighter. My father was investigating Marcus. She said it quietly, looking at the table. I did not put it together until months after the funeral. The legislation he was looking into, the shell companies, the redirected funds. Marcus was at the center of all of it. And now my father is dead, and I am married to the man who I believe killed him. And I have no proof. And no one who would believe me if I did. She stood. If he finds out I have said any of this to you, it will not go well for me. Stay away from me, please. Whatever you think you can do, you cannot. She turned toward the door, walked out into the night without looking back. Dominic stayed at his table for a long time. He turned his water glass slowly between his palms. He looked at the empty chair across from him. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and made a single phone call. I need everything you can find, he said quietly, on a politician named Marcus Hargrove and on a federal judge named Raymond Prescott, who died in a car accident 2 years ago. The file arrived 3 days later. Dominic read it at his desk in the back office of a building that appeared to anyone who cared to look to be an unremarkable import consultancy on the quieter side of the financial district. The office was spare. A desk, 2 chairs, a lamp that threw more shadow than light, a window that looked out onto a narrow alley where nothing interesting ever happened. He preferred it that way. Interesting things happened inside this room. The alley was for balance. The file was thick. His people were thorough. They had learned to be working for a man who considered incomplete information more dangerous than no information at all. He read slowly, methodically, the way he did everything, without reaction, without rushing, turning each page with the steady patience of someone who understood that the truth rarely announced itself in the first paragraph. It announced itself on page 14. The business holdings first. Marcus Hargrove maintained 17 registered companies across 4 jurisdictions. On paper, they were legitimate. Consulting firms, property holdings, infrastructure, investment vehicles. The kind of corporate architecture that wealthy men built to organize assets and minimize taxes. Nothing unusual. Nothing that would raise a flag at first glance. Except 4 of those companies had no operations, no employees, no offices, no contracts, just bank accounts that received large transfers on irregular schedules and redistributed those funds after careful layering through subsidiary accounts into holdings registered under a single name. Elena Hargrove. Dominic set the page down, picked it up again. Her name appeared 14 times across the financial documents, as director, as signatory, as the registered owner of accounts that had received over the past 4 years a combined total that made the number sit uncomfortably in the chest when you read it. She had not known. He was certain of that before he finished the page. The pattern was too clean, too deliberate, the kind of careful, methodical construction that required enormous effort to make one person appear guilty of something another person had done entirely. Marcus had not just been stealing from the city. He had been building a container for the blame, quietly, patiently, the way Elena had said he built everything. 4 years. He had been preparing this for 4 years, since before Judge Prescott's death, since before Elena stopped practicing law, since before the narrative of her instability had been seeded into the minds of everyone who might otherwise have believed her. Dominic kept reading. The political corruption was extensive but not surprising. Bribery payments routed through charitable foundations. Government contracts awarded to companies that donated generously to Marcus's campaign funds. Regulatory decisions that consistently favored specific corporate interests. The kind of corruption that flourished in plain sight because it dressed itself in the right vocabulary and surrounded itself with the right people. What surprised him was how far it reached. And then he turned to page 26, the infrastructure bill. 3 years ago, a sweeping piece of legislation that restructured commercial zoning regulations across the city. It had effectively closed several legitimate import and development operations that had not been given adequate notice or reasonable transition time. Dominic remembered the period with a clarity that had not dimmed. He had lost 4 businesses in 8 months because of that bill. 4 operations he had built carefully over years. Each one legitimate, each one employing people who depended on the work, each one dismantled by regulatory changes that arrived without warning and without recourse. He had requested a meeting with the relevant legislative committee, had been told through intermediaries that the legislator overseeing the bill had no interest in discussing exemptions or transition arrangements with men of his particular background. The message had been delivered with the specific smugness of someone who believed themselves untouchable. He had not known then that the legislator was Marcus Hargrove. He knew now, and there was more. Page 31. The accident report for Judge Raymond Prescott. Single vehicle, late night, a road the judge had driven 1,000 times. The police report noted mechanical failure as the probable cause. The investigation had been cursory. 11 days. No forensic analysis of the vehicle's brake lines. No examination of the judge's recent case files. No follow-up on the fact that Raymond Prescott had in the weeks before his death formally requested access to financial records connected to the city's commercial zoning legislation. The same legislation Marcus Hargrove had authored. The same legislation that had generated millions in redirected public funds. The same legislation that a sitting federal judge had been quietly, methodically investigating before his car went off a road he had driven without incident for 20 years. Dominic closed the file, sat back in his chair, looked at the lamp throwing its careful shadows across the wall. The complete picture was clarifying in the way that complete pictures always were. He had come into this expecting to find an abusive man using his wife as a shield. He had found exactly that, but he had also found something larger. A man who had built his entire existence on using other people as instruments. Who had looked at a federal judge and seen an obstacle? Who had looked at a frightened woman and seen legal infrastructure? Who had looked at the city itself and seen a mechanism for personal enrichment? Who had looked at Dominic years ago and seen someone disposable? He reached for his phone. "Keep going," he told Callahan. "Financial records, communications, anything with a timestamp. I want everything that exists. And I need you to find out who inspected Judge Prescott's vehicle after the accident." The second file arrived 5 days after the first. This one contained phone records. Partial transcripts from calls routed through an encrypted line that his people had taken considerable effort to access. Dominic read them at the same desk under the same lamp, with the same unhurried patience. The calls were between Marcus and a lawyer named Whitcomb, careful, deliberately vague conversations conducted in the language of men who had been trained to discuss dangerous things without ever saying them directly. But the architecture of what they were planning was visible beneath the careful words like bones beneath skin. They were preparing a public event, a gala, charity, high profile, maximum media attendance. The framing was philanthropic, but the purpose was surgical. Marcus intended to use the event to surface the financial irregularities connected to Elena's name, to present them publicly in front of journalists and federal prosecutors before any formal investigation could begin, to control the narrative completely, permanently. Once her reputation was destroyed in public, the divorce would follow. Her credibility gone, her name attached to crimes she had not committed. She would have no platform, no standing, no voice to contradict whatever story Marcus chose to tell. He would walk away clean. She would walk into a courtroom carrying everything he had done, and no one would listen when she talked about her father, because Marcus had already made sure 3 years in advance that no one listened to Elena Hargrove about anything. Dominic set the transcripts down on top of the first file. He thought about her in the bar, the ring she twisted, the tired, fractured thing her voice had become when she said she was so tired, the bruises she had learned to hide, the 4 years she had spent signing documents she did not understand while her husband quietly built the case that would destroy her. He thought about the 4 businesses he had lost, the meeting request dismissed without response, the particular contempt of a man who believed that power was permanent and consequences were for other people. He thought about a federal judge driving home on a road he had driven 1,000 times before and an investigation that lasted 11 days. Then Dominic stood, walked to the window, looked out at the narrow alley where nothing interesting ever happened. and made the decision that changed everything. Not out of vengeance, though, that was present, honest, and unadorned somewhere beneath the surface. Not out of desire, though, something about her burned at the edges of his thoughts in ways he had not examined. Out of the simple, unambiguous recognition that what was happening to Elena Hargrove was wrong, that what had happened to her father was wrong, and that he was one of the very few people in the city positioned to do anything about either. He turned from the window, set up a meeting, he said quietly, all of them, tonight. Callahan was already reaching for the phone. The meeting happened at 2 in the morning. Dominic did not hold meetings during business hours for things like this. Business hours were for things that could survive daylight. Legitimate contracts, public-facing decisions, the ordinary machinery of his above-ground operations. What happened in this office at this hour existed in a different category entirely. The 5 men seated around the table understood that distinction without being told. They had each in their own way built their professional lives around it. Dominic stood at the head of the table. No files in front of him, no notes. He had never needed them. His memory retained information the way stone retained cold. Completely. Permanently. 21 days, he said. Here's what we need. He spoke for 40 minutes without interruption. He laid out the scope of what Marcus had built, the shell companies. The fraudulent accounts, the encrypted communications, the gala that was designed to function as Elena's public execution. He described the evidence they had already gathered. He described the gaps that remained. He described in precise terms what closing those gaps would require. When he finished, the room was quiet. Not with reluctance. These were not men who shied from complexity. It was the specific silence of professionals recalibrating the scale of what they had been asked to accomplish. Then one by one they nodded. Mercer, the forensic accountant, a meticulous man who had spent 20 years untangling corporate structures for clients who paid extraordinarily well for discretion, began the next morning. He worked 4 consecutive days reconstructing the paper trail behind Marcus's 14 shell companies. Not just identifying the fraud, but documenting it in a format that would be immediately legible to a federal auditor, a journalist, or a judge. Every transfer, every date, every account number cross-referenced against the corresponding company registration, every layer of the financial architecture mapped and annotated until the picture was complete and the conclusion was inescapable. Mercer delivered his findings on a Tuesday evening, setting a bound document on Dominic's desk with the quiet satisfaction of a craftsman presenting finished work. Dominic read it in 2 hours. It was comprehensive, airtight, and it showed with a clarity that could not be argued with that every transaction registered under Elena Hargrove's name had originated from accounts she had no operational access to. Accounts controlled exclusively by Marcus and managed by 2 financial intermediaries, whose names appeared in 3 other fraud investigations across the past decade. Her signatures were on the documents, but the money had never touched anything she controlled. She had been used as a name on paper, nothing more. The recordings were harder. The communications specialist, a former signals analyst who operated under the simple arrangement of asking no questions and expecting the same courtesy in return, had been working for 10 days to compile usable audio from Marcus's encrypted line. The encryption was sophisticated military adjacent, which told Dominic something useful about the kind of relationships Marcus maintained. But sophisticated encryption still required human beings to operate it, and human beings made small, consistent errors. On day 11, the specialist placed a USB drive on Dominic's desk without a word. Dominic listened through headphones for 3 hours, making notes on a yellow legal pad in handwriting so small it was nearly illegible. 22 recordings. Combined runtime of 4 hours and 17 minutes. Conversations between Marcus and his lawyer. Between Marcus and his financial intermediaries. And one conversation, the one that made Dominic set down his pen and simply listen, between Marcus and a senior official in the city's financial crimes unit. A man whose job description included investigating exactly the kind of fraud Marcus had spent 4 years committing. The conversation lasted 9 minutes. In it, Marcus discussed the timeline of his plan with the casual confidence of a man describing a home renovation. The gala, the public disclosure, the divorce filing, and the assurance delivered with a tone of near boredom that the investigation, when it inevitably came, would find exactly what he had arranged for it to find. Dominic listened to it twice. The witnesses were the final piece, three former associates of Marcus, men who had worked inside the outer edges of his operation and had each, for different reasons, reached the limit of what they were willing to carry. One had been quietly discarded when he became inconvenient, cast aside like a tool that had outlived its usefulness. One had watched his own business methodically destroyed by Marcus's regulatory maneuvering, the same legislation that had gutted Dominic's operations. And one had simply developed over years of proximity to a man without conscience, a conscience of his own. Dominic met each of them separately, in different locations at different hours. He listened more than he spoke. He asked careful questions and received careful answers. He made no promises he could not keep and no threats he did not intend to follow through on. By the end of the third meeting, he had signed statements from all three corroborating the financial records, corroborating the recordings, filling the gaps that documents alone could not close. On the 15th day, sitting alone in his office, Dominic looked at everything spread across his desk: financial records, transaction logs, audio recordings, witness statements, corporate registration documents tracing every shell company back to its true origin, and the preliminary report from a private forensic mechanic who had at considerable effort and expense located and examined what remained of Judge Raymond Prescott's vehicle. The brake lines had been cut, not damaged, not worn through by time and neglect. Cut, cleanly, deliberately, by someone who understood exactly how to make a mechanical failure look like mechanical failure. Dominic stared at the report for a long time. Then he placed it carefully in the file beside everything else. He had 21 days. 6 remained. Everything was almost ready. No, most. He thought about Elena, about what she did not know, that in 6 days her husband planned to walk her into a ballroom full of cameras and use her as a sacrifice, burning her reputation, her finances, her freedom. That she would stand there in whatever dress she chose under chandelier light, completely unprepared for what was about to happen. That no one had told her, that no one could tell her. The plan required her genuine reaction, required the room to see what Marcus did to her in real time, unscripted, undeniable. The most powerful evidence was not in any document on this desk. It was what 100 witnesses would see with their own eyes. She was walking toward the trap alone, and there was nothing Dominic could do to warn her without risking Marcus discovering that his plan had been compromised. If Marcus sensed disruption, he would accelerate the timeline, change the venue, find another way. 4 years of preparation would scatter. The trap had to spring exactly as Marcus intended, just with a different outcome waiting on the other side. 6 days. Then Dominic received the call that compressed those 6 days into something much smaller. It was Callahan, 3 in the morning. The phone rang once before Dominic answered. He never let it ring twice at that hour. "She's in the hospital," Callahan said. His voice was level professional, but something beneath it had tightened. "St. Catherine's. She came in through the emergency entrance 40 minutes ago. Left arm ribs, facial contusions. She told them she fell." Dominic was already standing, and he moved the gala up. 6 days earlier. New date is Saturday. Dominic looked at the calendar on his wall. Saturday was in 5 days. He closed his eyes, opened them. The lamp threw its careful shadows across the desk, across the files, across everything he had built over 15 days of patient, meticulous work. 5 days. "Then we use every one of them," he said. He hung up, stood in the dark office for a moment. Then he reached for his coat and walked out into the night. In a hospital room across the city, Elena Hargrove lay beneath fluorescent lights with her left arm in a splint and tape across her ribs and mascara dried on her cheek from tears she had cried before the ambulance arrived. She stared at the ceiling and thought about her father, about the way he used to call after every verdict. Win or lose. The same words every time. "You stood up. That is what counts. You stood up." She closed her eyes, and somewhere beneath the exhaustion and the pain and the 4 years of accumulated damage, something that had not yet gone out, something stubborn and bright and furious burned quietly in her chest like an ember waiting for air. She had not always been this. That was the thing people never understood about women in her position. They looked at the bruises and the flinching and the careful smiles, and they saw someone who had always been fragile, who had been born into the posture of a victim and simply grown into the role. They did not see the woman who had argued constitutional law before panels of judges who tried to rattle her and failed, who had won 11 consecutive motions in her first year of practice, who had stood in a courtroom at 27 years old and told a corporate defense team with 40 years of combined experience that their argument was not just wrong, but embarrassingly wrong, and then proved it with evidence she had compiled herself over 6 weekends. Her father had been in the gallery that day. She had not known he was there until after the verdict. He met her in the hallway outside the courtroom. He did not congratulate her. He did not need to. He simply put his hand on her shoulder and looked at her with the particular expression of a man who has just witnessed his child become exactly the person he hoped they would be. That woman still existed inside Elena Hargrove, buried beneath 4 years of systematic demolition, beneath the bruises and the isolation and the carefully constructed narrative of instability that Marcus had woven around her like a shroud. But she existed. She was still there. And on this particular night, lying in a hospital bed with tape across her ribs and the fluorescent light humming above her like something mechanical and indifferent, that woman opened her eyes. She thought about the files she had glimpsed in Marcus's home office 3 weeks ago, the ones he kept in the bottom drawer of his mahogany desk, the drawer that was always locked. The drawer she was never supposed to touch. She had seen him open it once late at night when he thought she was asleep, had watched through a crack in the bedroom door as he sat beneath the green banker's lamp reading documents with an expression she had never seen before. Satisfied, comprehensive, the face of a man reviewing a project that was nearing completion. She had memorized the make of the lock, a 4-digit combination. She had watched Marcus's fingers on the dial enough times through enough barely open doors to know 3 of the 4 numbers. The 4th would require trying. She lay in the hospital bed and thought about that lock, about what was behind it, about the fact that Marcus had moved the gala up 6 days, which meant something had changed, which meant whatever he was planning was accelerating. And she thought about her father, and the ember burned. 2 days later, Elena came home from the hospital. Marcus met her at the door with the particular solicitousness he always displayed after the worst incidents. A hand at her elbow, a glass of water placed carefully within reach. The performance of care so practiced, it had become indistinguishable from automation. "Are you feeling better?" he asked. His voice was warm, concerned. The voice he used in public deployed now in their home with the same professional ease. She said she was. She thanked him for bringing her things to the hospital. She sat at the island and drank the water and let him believe that the night had broken something else inside her as he intended that another piece of resistance had been ground away. She let him believe that because believing it served her purpose. Because for the first time in 4 years, Elena Hargrove had a purpose beyond survival. That night, Marcus left for a dinner meeting at 9. She waited 20 minutes. Then she walked down the hallway to his office. The door was unlocked. He never locked it. He did not need to. The message had been communicated through years of consequence. This room was his. These things were his. Her presence here was not forbidden explicitly. It was simply understood in the way that all of Marcus's boundaries were understood through the memory of what happened when they were crossed. She sat down at his desk. The green banker's lamp threw its circle of light across the mahogany surface. The bottom drawer was to her right. The combination lock faced upward. She had 3 numbers. She tried the 4th systematically. It took 11 attempts. Her hands were steady, the hands of a woman who had decided something and was no longer afraid of the decision. The lock opened. Inside the drawer, she found a leather portfolio monogrammed expensive. She opened it. Inside were 3 things that changed everything. The first was a detailed timeline, handwritten, Marcus's precise architectural script. It outlined in chronological sequence every step of the plan to publicly destroy her at the gala, the documents he would present, the order in which he would read them, the placement of specific journalists in the room, the divorce filing that his lawyer would submit the following morning. Everything. Her destruction organized into phases and deliverables. The second item was a USB drive, small, unmarked. She took it, slipped it into the pocket of her robe and replaced it with an identical blank drive she had purchased that afternoon at a pharmacy on her way home from the hospital. A small, deliberate act of preparation that the woman she had been 6 weeks ago would not have been capable of. The third item stopped her breathing, a single page. handwritten like the timeline. A list of names and notes in the shorthand Marcus used for sensitive matters. And at the boss, two words that detonated something inside her chest. Prescott. Handled. She stared at those words for a long time. The green light from the lamp fell across them. Her father's name and her husband's handwriting, followed by a word that meant exactly what she had feared for 2 years and could never prove. Her hands began to shake. Not with fear, not anymore. With something harder than fear. Something that had survived for 4 years of systematic demolition and emerged from the wreckage not weaker but refined, compressed, concentrated into something that could cut. She photographed every page, both sides, every document in the portfolio. She worked quickly, methodically, with the efficiency of a woman who had been trained to handle evidence by a father who spent 23 years on the federal bench. She returned everything to the drawer, closed the lock, walked out of the office, went upstairs, sat on the edge of the bed in the dark. When Marcus came home at midnight, she was lying in bed with her eyes closed, breathing evenly. The photograph saved to a device hidden in a compartment of her jewelry box that she had constructed herself behind the velvet lining in the space meant for warranty cards. She did not sleep that night. She lay beside the man who had killed her father and planned to destroy her, and she breathed evenly, and she waited for morning. In the morning, she went to Lantern. It was not a Tuesday. Callahan was sitting in the corner booth. He looked up when she entered, and she understood immediately that Dominic had positioned him there. That this quiet, precise man was a bridge between where she stood and wherever Dominic was waiting. She sat down across from him. "I have something," she said, and placed the phone containing the photographs on the table. Callahan looked at the phone. Something moved in his expression. Not surprise. Recognition. The specific recognition of someone who understood that the woman sitting across from him had just done something extraordinarily dangerous and extraordinarily brave. He picked up the phone. "The USB drive needs to be copied and the original returned before tomorrow night," Elena said. "And page 12, bottom of the page, there is a notation about my father. Dominic needs to see it." Callahan nodded once, stood, slipped the phone into his inner pocket, walked out. That evening in the office above the financial district, Dominic Ashford read the words "Prescott, handled," written in Marcus Hargrove's own hand. He set the photograph down beside the forensic report, confirming that Judge Raymond Prescott's brake lines had been deliberately cut. He sat in the lamplight for a long time. Then he called Callahan. "Tell her it is going to work. Tell her she will not walk into that room alone. Tell her when the moment comes she will know." A pause, and Callahan, "Make sure she understands what she found tonight. That is the piece that finishes everything. Without her, none of this holds together. She is not someone we are saving. She is someone who saved herself. We are just making sure the room is ready when she stands up." He hung up. 5 days had become 4. The gala was Saturday. The evidence was complete. Dominic turned off the lamp, sat in the darkness, and allowed himself for the first time since this began to think about what was coming. Not the evidence, not the logistics. About Elena standing at his corner table 8 weeks ago, pulling out a chair without invitation, looking at him with exhausted eyes and asking a question so raw, it had no polish left. "What are you?" He thought about what she had been, what Marcus had tried to unmake her into, and what she had proven alone in that office with a combination lock and a camera, and the kind of courage that could not be given by anyone else she still was. The city hummed outside the window. Saturday was coming. Every piece was in place. The only question was whether that room was ready for what Elena Hargrove was about to become. The ballroom looked like something designed to make ordinary people feel the precise dimensions of their own insignificance. Not cruelly, in the way that genuine grandeur operated, by existing at a scale that reminded you quietly and without malice that you were standing inside something larger than yourself. Crystal chandeliers descended in 3 cascading tiers from a ceiling painted the color of antique ivory. The marble floor reflected the light back upward in warm, fractured patterns that shifted as people moved across it, as though the room itself were alive beneath their feet. Circular tables draped in white linen held arrangements of ivory roses and trailing greenery, each centered with a candle that threw soft gold across the faces of the people seated around them. 100 guests, exactly as Marcus had planned. They arrived the way powerful people always arrive to things, not punctually, with the practiced timing of those who understood that appearing neither first nor last was its own form of social currency. Senators greeted journalists with handshakes calibrated to suggest friendship without commitment. Corporate executives exchanged pleasantries with city officials whose regulatory decisions affected their quarterly earnings. Three media editors stood in a loose cluster near the bar, assessing the room, the way editors assessed everything, calculating the ratio of story to spectacle. The room hummed with conversation and the delicate percussion of crystal being lifted and set down. Dominic arrived at 7:43. He positioned himself near the back wall, accepted a glass of water from a passing server, and watched the room assemble itself. Dark suit, black shirt, no tie. He had dressed the way he always dressed, not to blend in, not to stand out, with the indifference of a man who had stopped considering how rooms perceived him a long time ago. The neck tattoos drew brief looks from several guests nearest to him. He did not acknowledge them. Callahan was stationed near the east entrance. Two associates were positioned at the ballroom's AV control station, a narrow booth behind a curtain at the north end, where the screens and sound system were managed. They had arranged access 3 days earlier through a contact on the venue's technical staff. The USB drive was loaded. The screens were ready. The audio was cued. Everything was in place. Dominic allowed himself one moment of stillness, one breath in which he considered the full weight of what was about to happen. In the next 90 minutes, either Marcus Hargrove would succeed in destroying his wife's life in front of 100 cameras, or Dominic and Elena would dismantle the empire of a man who had operated above consequence for a decade. There was no middle ground, no partial victory, no second attempt if something went wrong. The evidence was comprehensive and devastating, but it required the room. It required the witnesses. It required Marcus to begin his performance before the counter-performance could begin. If anything disrupted the sequence, if Marcus sensed the trap before he walked into it, the entire architecture would collapse and Elena would be left exposed, her cover blown, her husband aware that she had moved against him with no protection and no recourse. Dominic had not slept in 31 hours. He did not feel it. He had operated on less sleep in harder rooms than this one. What he felt was the specific, concentrated attention of a man who had aligned every variable he could control and was now waiting for the one variable he could not. The human element, the unpredictable part, the 100 people in this room and the specific unknowable ways they would react when the truth began to surface. He took a sip of water, set the glass down, and watched the entrance. Elena arrived at 8. She wore emerald green, the same deep luminous shade she had worn the first night he noticed her at the bar, the color that had first caught in the amber light and made him look twice. A sleek, floor-length dress that moved with her like water, catching the chandelier light in a way that made her look almost incandescent. Dark waves of hair fell across her bare shoulders, small diamond earrings, a single bracelet on her left wrist positioned with the careful deliberateness he recognized. She moved through the entrance with the composed grace of a woman who had attended 100 events like this and understood exactly what was expected of her at each one. She looked stunning. She also looked like someone who had not slept in 3 days, which Dominic knew because Callahan had confirmed it. She had spent those 3 days preparing herself for what was coming. Not physically. The dress, the earrings, the careful arrangement of her hair. Those things required minutes, not days. She had spent the time preparing something else entirely. The internal architecture of a woman about to walk into the worst night of her life, knowing it was coming, knowing what her husband planned to do and choosing to walk in anyway. She smiled at the right moments, accepted greetings with practiced warmth, shook hands, exchanged the small, polished nothings that events like this demanded. She was performing flawlessly. The perfect political wife. The woman Marcus needed the room to see before he tore her apart. But Dominic watched her hands. She was twisting the ring. He looked away before she could feel his gaze and find him. She could not know he was here. Not yet. If she saw him, if her expression changed in any way that Marcus might notice, it would alert instincts that Dominic could not afford to trigger. Not tonight. He stayed near the back wall, and he waited. Marcus was magnificent at this. Dominic had known it intellectually from the files, from the recordings, from the documented history of a man who had built an entire career on public performance. But watching it in person was something else entirely. Marcus worked the room with the ease of someone who genuinely enjoyed being observed, touching shoulders, laughing at precisely the right moments, leaning in when someone spoke as though their words were the most fascinating thing he had encountered all evening. He greeted Elena publicly with a hand at the small of her back and a smile that reached his eyes completely. Dominic watched her absorb the touch without flinching, watched her return the smile, watched the small invisible adjustment in her posture, the bracing, the preparation, the muscle memory of a woman who had learned to receive affection from this man as a warning rather than a comfort. Nobody else in the room saw any of it. They saw a powerful couple, an attractive wife, a charming politician. The particular glamour that political marriages projected when the lighting was right and the cameras were rolling. The dinner proceeded through its choreographed movements. A speech from the foundation director, warm and professional. A video presentation about the charity's work over the past year, polished footage of children in community centers, and the kind of imagery that made wealthy people feel their donations were doing something tangible. Everything legitimate, everything convincing. Marcus sat at the head table with the comfortable confidence of a man whose plan was running exactly on schedule. He ate. He laughed. He leaned over twice to whisper something in Elena's ear that made her smile in a way that looked genuine from across the room and was Dominic knew anything but. At 9:47, Marcus reached beneath the table and placed his hand briefly on the folder beside his chair. A small gesture, almost invisible. The gesture of a man confirming the presence of a weapon before entering a room where he intended to use it. Dominic turned his head slightly toward the AV booth. Callahan near the east entrance shifted his weight. The two associates in the booth received the signal through their earpieces. Ready. At 10 o'clock precisely, Marcus rose from his chair. The room responded immediately. Conversations quieting, faces turning. The instinctive attention that a room gave to a man it had been trained to regard as important. He buttoned his jacket, adjusted the white boutonniere, picked up the folder, walked to the microphone with the unhurried ease of someone who owned every molecule of air in the room. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you for being here tonight, not just as supporters of this foundation, but as people I trust. He let the words settle. Trust. Placed it carefully in the air, the way a jeweler placed a stone in a setting. Then he continued. There is something I can no longer stay silent about. He opened the folder. The room went very quiet. Dominic watched Elena. She was sitting at the head table with her hands flat on the white linen, completely still. Her face was composed with a precision that most people in the room would have read as shock. Dominic read it differently. He saw preparation. He saw a woman holding herself together not because she was falling apart, but because she had decided exactly when and how she was going to move, and that moment had not yet arrived. My wife Marcus said, looking out at the 100 faces, the cameras, the journalists already reaching for their phones, has been stealing from this city for 4 years. The word hit the room like a physical thing. Gasps. The low, terrible murmur of 100 people recalibrating everything they thought they knew about the woman at the head table. Marcus began reading from the documents. Every illegal transfer, every fraudulent account, every dollar rerouted from public infrastructure funds into private holdings. He held each page up for the cameras. His voice carried the practiced weight of reluctant disclosure. A man in pain, a man betrayed a man who was sharing this only because his conscience demanded it. Her signature is on all of it. He looked directly at Elena. The room turned with him. 100 pairs of eyes swiveling toward a woman in an emerald dress who had just been publicly named as a criminal by her own husband. The specific terrible choreography of public humiliation, the accuser pointing the audience, turning the accused standing alone beneath the weight of 100 simultaneous judgments. Elena knew this moment was coming. She had prepared for it, had spent 3 sleepless nights building the internal architecture to withstand it. But knowing something is coming and feeling it arrive are different experiences entirely. The way knowing fire is hot and placing your hand in the flame are different experiences. The weight of those eyes, the phones rising like weapons, the specific sensation of being recorded at your worst moment of becoming content, of your pain being filed away as something to discuss at brunch tomorrow. She felt all of it. Phones appeared, dozens of them, screens glowing upward, cameras angling toward her face with the particular urgency of people who understood they were documenting something that would be discussed tomorrow on every news outlet in the city. Elena stood. The movement looked involuntary, the body's instinct to face a threat upright rather than absorb it seated. She stood and she looked at her husband across the distance of the table. "That is not," she started, but her voice came out wrong. Too quiet, too fractured. The microphone was in Marcus's hand, and the room was his, and the sound system was calibrated to amplify his voice, not hers. "The signatures are documented," Marcus said gently, turning back to the audience, not raising his voice, not needing to. "The transfers are dated, the accounts are verifiable." Someone at a back table laughed, a single low sound. Elena heard it. Dominic watched her hear it. He watched something cross her face that was not part of the plan, that was not preparation or performance, but the genuine unscripted pain of a woman being laughed at in the worst moment of her life. The three-tiered cake on the display table beside the stage caught her shoulder as she stepped backward. The table rocked. The cake fell the way beautiful things fell, slowly enough to observe, too fast to prevent. Three tiers separating on the way down, white frosting scattering across the marble, gold leaf catching chandelier light briefly on its way to the floor. Elena did not look at it, not look at. She was looking at Marcus, and Marcus was looking back at her with the expression of a man who had just completed something he had been building for a very long time. Satisfied, complete. The architect surveying his finished structure. Her legs gave out. Not dramatically, not in the theatrical way of someone performing a feint. She simply stopped being able to hold herself upright. The structural failure of a person who had been bearing weight for too long in too many directions. She went down beside the ruined cake, dark hair falling across her face, emerald dress pooling around her on the cold marble. The crowd erupted. Gasps. Voices overlapping. The scrape of chairs as people stood without knowing why. Phones still recording. Nobody moved toward her. The specific paralysis of a crowd caught between scandal and conscience held every person in that room where they stood. Nobody moved except one man. Dominic was already crossing the floor before she finished falling. He moved through the crowd the way he always moved, without announcement, without urgency, following the direct line between himself and where he needed to be. People stepped aside without knowing why. Something in his bearing communicated a certainty of destination that crowds instinctively deferred to. He reached her in 11 seconds, knelt on the marble among the scattered frosting and broken sugar flowers. Her eyes were open, dark and glassy, swimming with something that was not unconsciousness, but the specific disorientation of a body that had made decisions the mind had not yet caught up to. She looked at him. He looked at her. And in that moment, a communication passed between them that required no words. That she was ready. That it was time. That the worst was almost over, and what came next was hers. He slid one arm beneath her shoulders, the other beneath her knees. Lifted her, stood slowly, steadily. Her head rested against his shoulder. Her dark hair fell back from her face. The emerald dress draped across his arms like a banner. The ballroom went silent. Then Marcus's voice tore through the speakers. Put her down low. Controlled the first crack of something beneath the politician's surface. Eugene looked up. Marcus had come around the head table. He stood 10 feet away, broad-shouldered in his tuxedo white boutonniere, slightly askew, jaw set with the rigid tension of a man whose plan had just developed an unexpected variable. His finger leveled across the distance between them. I said, put her down. Louder now. The microphone's still live. Who the hell do you think you are? The room waited. Get away from her before you regret it. 7 words. And the room recognized who was holding the politician's wife. And nobody breathed. Then the screens came on. No announcement, no transition. Just the sudden illumination of 4 large displays at the ballroom's cardinal point screens that had been cycling through the foundation's charitable imagery all evening. Now they showed numbers, account numbers, transfer dates, corporate registration documents, the kind of financial architecture that meant nothing to a civilian, but everything to the journalists and federal prosecutors in the room. Marcus turned toward the nearest screen. The color left his face. Not gradually, instantly. The specific blanching of a man seeing the foundations of his constructed world develop a crack that ran all the way through. Turn those off, his voice was barely controlled. Turn them off now. Nobody in the booth responded. The screens continued. A new document appeared, a corporate registration form for one of Marcus's shell companies. The name of the registered director highlighted not Elena Hargrove, not any name attached to her, but a name connected directly to an account Marcus controlled personally. The account that had originated every transfer subsequently routed through her name. The paper trail was simple when you saw it laid out. Devastatingly, inescapably simple. A journalist near the front leaned toward her colleague and said something quiet. The colleague was already typing. Then the audio began. Marcus's own voice came through the ballroom speakers. Not live, recorded, slightly compressed, unmistakably him. The investigation will find what I have arranged for it to find. That is not a concern. A pause on the recording. His lawyer's voice responding. Then Marcus again. She signs whatever I put in front of her. Has done for 4 years. By the time anyone looks closely, the narrative will already be set. The ballroom was absolutely motionless. 100 people standing or sitting exactly where they had been when the audio began. As though movement might break something they needed to remain intact. They were simply listening. Marcus set the microphone down on the head table, the gesture of a man who had just understood that the instrument of his control was no longer useful. "This is fabricated," he said. His voice had lost its polish, the warmth gone. Something harder underneath, angular and exposed. The real voice. The one Elena had heard in private for 4 years, but no one in this room had ever encountered. The voice that preceded the worst things. Every piece of this has been fabricated by a criminal with a personal vendetta. He was pointing now, not at Elena, at the screens, at the room, at the vague, shapeless enemy he was attempting to conjure in the minds of people who were already beyond convincing. His hands were shaking, not with the trembling of fear, but with the specific agitation of a man who had always been able to control the room and was now experiencing for the first time in his adult life the sensation of a room that refused to be controlled. He turned to the journalists, the people he had cultivated for years, the editors he had fed exclusive stories to, the reporters whose careers had benefited from their proximity to his office. He looked for the loyalty he had purchased. He found screens reflecting the light of a truth he had never intended anyone to see. Dominic Ashford is a known, but the screens were not finished. A new document appeared. The forensic report on Judge Raymond Prescott's vehicle, the brake line analysis. The conclusion stated in the clinical language of a mechanical forensic specialist that the failure was not accidental. The room shifted again, a new register of silence. The silence of people who had just realized they were not watching a financial scandal unfold. They were watching something much larger. And then the final document appeared on every screen. A photograph enlarged and clear of a handwritten page in Marcus Hargrove's own script. A page from his leather portfolio, names, dates, coded notes, and at the bottom 2 words in his unmistakable hand. Prescott, handled. The silence that followed was not the silence of confusion. It was the silence of comprehension, of 100 intelligent, powerful, connected people processing the full architecture of what they had been shown. Financial fraud, forged evidence, a planned public destruction of an innocent woman, and now this, the assassination of a federal judge, ordered by a sitting politician, documented in his own hand. A woman at the second table covered her mouth with both hands. A journalist who had been typing on his phone stopped and simply stared at the screen. One of the federal prosecutors near the bar set down his glass with a deliberateness that communicated something to his colleague without words. The colleague nodded. Elena let the silence do its work. She understood silence the way her father had taught her to understand it, as a tool, as a space where truth could expand to fill the room without being crowded by words. She had spent 4 years having her silence used against her. Tonight she was using it for herself. Marcus broke. Not visibly, not in any way the cameras would capture as dramatic, but something behind his eyes, the mechanism that had always allowed him to calculate and adjust and perform, simply stopped functioning. His face went slack. His jaw loosened. He looked at his wife standing at the microphone with his own handwriting projected behind her, and the expression on his face was not rage, not defiance, not the careful composure of a man preparing his next move. It was the expression of a man who had just realized completely and irreversibly that the game was over. The ballroom doors opened. A man in a dark suit that was not a tuxedo entered. Behind him, 4 others in identical configuration. Their posture communicated their function to every person in the room before a single badge was displayed. Marcus Hargrove, we would like you to come with us. His voice was professional, without drama, the tone of law enforcement that had already completed its paperwork. You have no grounds, Marcus started, but his voice had no force behind it. The words came out as reflex, not strategy. We have the financial records, the audio recordings, 3 sign and witness statements, and the forensic vehicle report. We have had them for 72 hours. We were waiting for the appropriate moment. The agent paused, looked at the screens, looked back at Marcus. Your event provided the audience. Marcus turned to the room, to the journalists, to the senators and prosecutors and donors, and the 100 people who had watched his empire collapse in real time. He was searching for something, an ally, a sympathetic face, a single person in the room who might still believe his version of events. He found none. She is lying, he said, his voice cracking at the edges. She is mentally unwell. I have documented. We have reviewed your documentation, the agent said. We have also reviewed the documentation you did not intend us to see. He gestured toward the screens, including the notation regarding Judge Prescott. Marcus's mouth closed, his jaw worked silently. Then he said the last thing he would say as a free man in a room he had built for his wife's destruction. You have no idea what you are doing. The agent said nothing. He simply waited, the way patient men waited when the outcome was no longer in question. 2 agents moved forward. Marcus's hands were guided behind his back. The click of the cuffs was quiet, almost inaudible, but in the absolute silence of the ballroom, it carried to every corner. 100 people heard it. 100 phones recorded it. Marcus was walked toward the exit. He passed within 10 feet of Elena. She stood at the microphone. He looked at her. She looked at him. She did not speak. She did not need to. Her standing there upright with her father's name on the screen behind her and the microphone in her hand, and the specific, unbreakable clarity in her eyes said everything that needed to be said. He was walked out. The doors closed behind him. The sound of them closing carried a finality that settled over the ballroom like a physical weight. But the evening was not finished. Not quite. As Marcus disappeared through the exit, one of the agents remained behind. He crossed the ballroom floor to where Senator Whitfield had been sitting. The senator was already on his feet, his face the color of wet concrete, speaking rapidly into his phone. The agent approached, said something quiet. The senator lowered the phone, his mouth open, closed. He looked at the agent, then at the screens now cycling through documents that included his own name in the financial chain, contracts he had approved, regulatory decisions he had signed, campaign donations that originated from accounts that were now very publicly known to be instruments of fraud. The senator sat down heavily. The agent remained at his side, not arresting him, not yet, simply establishing a presence that communicated to the senator and to everyone watching that the scope of this evening's consequences extended well beyond a single politician and a single ballroom. The room erupted, not with chaos, with the particular energy of 100 people simultaneously releasing something they had been holding. Journalists surged toward the exits to file stories. Guests turned to each other. 2 senators who had been photographed shaking Marcus's hand earlier that evening began a rapid whispered conversation with their respective aides. And then a woman moved through the crowd. She was in her mid-60s, silver hair pulled back simply, a navy dress elegant but understated. She had been seated at a far table all evening, a guest whose name had appeared on the invitation list through a channel she did not fully understand, delivered by a man named Callahan, who had appeared at her door 3 days ago and said simply that her daughter needed her to be in a particular room on a particular night. Nora Prescott had not spoken to her daughter in 14 months. She had believed, because Marcus had told her with such convincing concern, that Elena was unwell, that Elena needed space, that the drinking had gotten worse, that the best thing a mother could do was step back and let the professionals handle it. She had believed him because he was so convincing, because he cried when he told her, because he seemed so genuinely worried, because the alternative that the man her daughter had married was a monster who had killed her husband and was systematically destroying her child was so enormous and so terrible that believing it would have required dismantling everything she thought she understood about the world and about herself. And because there was guilt, The quiet, persistent guilt of a mother who had not protected her daughter, who had watched Elena marry Marcus and felt uneasy but said nothing, who had noticed the way Elena's light dimmed at family gatherings, the way her laugh became quieter and more careful, the way she stopped calling to share the small daily victories that had once been the rhythm of their relationship. Nora had noticed all of it and told herself it was the normal adjustment of marriage, of growing up, of a young woman finding her own way. She had been wrong, and she had been terribly, devastatingly wrong. And the 14 months of silence that followed were not the silence of a mother giving her daughter space. They were the silence of a woman who had chosen the easier belief because the harder truth was too painful to face. She had heard everything tonight. Every word, every recording, every document. She had seen her husband's name on that screen. Prescott, handled, Raymond, her Raymond, the man she had loved for 37 years. The man who had read their daughter bedtime stories about justice and courage and standing up for what was right. That man had been murdered, and the murderer had sat at her table and cried and told her that Elena needed space. She moved through the crowd. People stepped asking. Elena was still standing at the head table, the microphone lowered, her composure beginning to fracture now that the performance was finished and the adrenaline was receding, and the full weight of what had just happened was settling onto her shoulders. She saw her mother. Nora walked directly to her. No hesitation, no preliminary words. She walked to her daughter and put her arms around her and held her the way she should have held her 14 months ago, and 2 years ago, and 4 years ago, the way she would have held her if she had known, if she had looked more carefully, if she had trusted her own child instead of the man who had been lying to all of them. "Forgive me," Nora said. Her voice broke on the second word. "Forgive me, Elena." Elena's arms came up around her mother, her face pressed into Nora's shoulder, and the composure she had maintained through the entire evening, through the accusation, through the fall, through the screens, through the speech, through the arrest, finally and completely gave way. She cried the way people cried when they had been holding it for years, without sound at first, then with everything. Her whole body shaking against her mother's, the emerald dress crushed between them, mascara and tears, and the release of something so large and so long contained that it required her entire physical being to express it. Nora held her. The ballroom moved around them. Journalists filed, spoke into radios. Guests departed in clusters, speaking in the urgent, excited tones of people who had just witnessed history. None of it touched them. They stood in the middle of a hurricane of consequence and held each other, and the world waited. Dominic watched from the back wall. He had not moved since Elena took the microphone, had not needed to. The moment she stood up, the moment she picked up that microphone and spoke her father's name into a room full of witnesses, the plan had ceased to be his and become hers. He was simply a man standing against a wall watching a woman do what she had been born to do. Callahan appeared at his shoulder. FBI has Marcus in custody. His lawyer Whitcomb was detained at his residence 20 minutes ago. Senator Whitfield is being contacted for questioning in connection with the regulatory manipulation. Dominic nodded. The forensic report on Judge Prescott's vehicle has been formally entered into evidence. Federal investigation will be opened within 48 hours. Dominic nodded again. His eyes had not left Elena and her mother. "Sir, do you want me to bring the car around?" "Not yet," Dominic said quietly. "Give them a minute." They stood in silence. The ballroom was emptying around them. Staff began moving through the space with the careful efficiency of people cleaning up after something extraordinary. The cake remained on the floor. Nobody had touched it. It had become, without anyone deciding it consciously, a kind of marker. The spot where something had ended and something else had begun. Eventually, Elena lifted her head from her mother's shoulder. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, looked at the room around her as though seeing it for the first time. The empty chairs, the abandoned champagne glasses, the screens now dark, the spot on the floor where she had fallen. She looked toward the back wall, found Dominic. Their eyes met across the distance of the room. 50 feet of marble and candlelight and the wreckage of an evening that neither of them would ever forget. She did not wave, did not call out, did not move toward him. She simply looked at him, and in that look was everything she could not yet say. Gratitude that had no adequate container. Recognition of what he had done and what it had cost and what it meant. And something else, something quieter buried beneath the gratitude and the exhaustion and the still raw edges of everything that had just happened. The recognition that she was looking at the first person in 4 years from hers who had seen her clearly and chosen to act. Dominic held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded. Once. The small, certain nod of a man who had done what he came to do and required nothing from it. He turned, walked toward the exit. Callahan followed. The night air hit them as they stepped outside. Cool, clean, carrying the faint metropolitan smell that outdoor air always carried after too long inside a sealed, climate-controlled room. Dominic stood on the service road for a moment, looked up at the sky where the diluted stars that survived the city's light made their modest, persistent case for existence. Then he walked to the car, got in, and disappeared into the city the way he always had, without announcement, without ceremony. Following the path that led him back to the shadows at the edges of things where men like him existed and had always existed doing the work that needed to be done in the spaces that daylight could not reach. Behind him, through the ballroom's gilded walls, Elena Hargrove stood beside her mother in a room that was no longer a trap. Her left hand was bare. The ring sat on the table where she had placed it, heavy and brilliant and belonging to a chapter that was finally irrevocably finished. She looked at her mother. Nora looked at her. And for the first time in 4 years, neither of them had to pretend that everything was fine. Because for the first time in 4 years, something was. The night air hit her face the way cold water hits skin after a fever, a shock at first, then a relief so complete it was almost painful. Elena stood on the service road behind the ballroom with her mother's arm linked through hers. The sounds from inside were muffled now. Distant voices and the controlled commotion of a room being emptied by law enforcement and managed by event staff who had been trained for emergencies, but not for this. Not for a political collapse broadcast in real time to 100 phones. The city spread before them in its ordinary configuration of light and dark. Traffic moving on distant streets. The soft amber glow of buildings that had no idea what had just happened in one particular ballroom, in one particular part of town. The vast, indifferent machinery of a place that continued regardless of what occurred inside any single room on any single night. Elena breathed. The air was cool and clean, and she breathed it in, deeply filling lungs that had been operating at partial capacity for hours, possibly for years. The specific, unconscious shallowness of someone who had learned that taking up too much space, even the space required to breathe fully, could trigger consequences. She breathed now, fully, without calculation, without checking first whether it was safe. Her left hand was bare. The ring was inside the ballroom on the table where she had placed it. She did not know exactly when she had removed it. At some point during the speech or after, in the blur of adrenaline and tears and her mother's arms. It did not matter when. What mattered was the absence of it, the specific physical lightness of a finger that had carried weight for 4 years and was now carrying nothing. She looked at her hand in the dim light. The skin beneath where the ring had been was pale, slightly indented, a groove worn into her finger by years of pressure. A mark that would fade in time but was for now visible evidence of what had been there and what was no longer. "Mom," she said. The word came out strange. She had not used it in 14 months. It felt simultaneously familiar and foreign, like returning to a house you grew up in and finding the furniture rearranged. "I am here," Nora said. Her arm tightened through Elena's. "I am right here." They stood together in the cool air. Behind them, the ballroom's service door opened and closed as staff moved equipment out. 2 agents walked past, speaking into radios. A catering van started its engines somewhere in the parking area. The ordinary sounds of an extraordinary evening being dismantled. "Where will you go tonight?" Nora asked. The question was practical, maternal, the kind of question that anchored a person in the immediate when the larger picture was too overwhelming to process. Elena considered it. The house she had shared with Marcus was not a place she could return to. Not because of danger, Marcus was in custody and would remain there, but because the house itself was contaminated. Every room held a memory she did not want. Every surface had been touched by a man who had built his entire existence on her destruction. Going back there would be like returning to a prison after the door had been opened. Technically possible, psychologically unendurable. "I do not know," she said honestly. "Come home with me," Nora said, and the simplicity of the offer. The specific, uncomplicated warmth of a mother telling her child to come home undid something in Elena's chest that all the evidence and speeches and dramatic revelations of the evening had not quite reached. She nodded, could not speak for a moment, then managed barely a single word. Okay, a car appeared at the end of the service road. Dark, quiet. Callahan at the wheel, headlights low. He pulled up beside them and got out, opening the rear door without a word. He looked at Elena, then at Nora. His expression was composed, professional, but something in the way he held the door communicated respect for what had just happened and what was still happening in the space between these two women. Elena paused before getting in. She looked back toward the building. The ballroom's exterior was unremarkable from this angle. Plain concrete service equipment, the utilitarian architecture that existed behind every grand facade. No crystal chandeliers visible from here. No marble floors. Just a building. Just a place where something had happened. She looked for Dominic. He was not there. He had left already, she realized. Slipped out the way he did everything, without announcement, without requiring recognition, following whatever path led him back to the spaces he occupied at the edges of things. She thought about him for a moment, about the first night at the bar when he had simply stood near the door and said, "Someone is hurting you," about the steady, patient way he had gathered the evidence, about the moment he lifted her from the marble floor and held her against his chest, and the specific, extraordinary sensation of being held by someone whose arms did not require anything from her in return. She thought about the fact that he had left without saying goodbye, and she understood, in the way that two people who had shared something significant sometimes understood each other's choices without explanation, that his leaving was not indifference. It was intention. He was giving her the space to walk out of this building as the woman who had stood up for herself, not as the woman who had been rescued by a man. He understood the difference, and the fact that he understood it made her trust him more than any words he could have said. She got into the car. Nora got in beside her. Callahan closed the door, walked around to the driver's side, and pulled away from the building with the careful, unhurried pace of a man who understood that the passengers in his back seat needed the ride to feel like something other than urgency. The city moved past the windows, streetlights, other cars. The neon of a late-night diner where a waitress stood behind the counter, reading something on her phone. The dark windows of closed shops. A couple walking a dog on a quiet sidewalk, inhabiting a version of tonight that had nothing to do with ballrooms or federal agents or the handwriting of a man who had murdered a judge. Elena watched it all pass with the detached, absorptive attention of someone returning to the world after a long absence. Everything looked the same. Everything felt different. The city had not changed. She had. The woman who had entered that ballroom 4 hours ago in an emerald dress, terrified and prepared, was not the woman sitting in this car now. That woman had been carrying something. This woman had set it down. She reached over and took her mother's hand. Nora's fingers closed around hers immediately, tightly, with the specific fierceness of a mother who had just gotten her daughter back and was not going to let go again for anything. They rode the rest of the way in silence. Not the heavy silence of things unsaid, the comfortable silence of things that would be said when the time came and did not need to be rushed. The silence of two people who had been separated by a lie and were now sitting beside each other in the truth, and the truth, despite everything it contained, despite the grief and the anger and the years of damage, was better. It was always better. Callahan pulled up in front of a colonial on a quiet street lined with oak trees. White clapboard, black shutters, a front porch with two chairs that had been there since before Elena was born. He opened the door for them. Elena stepped out onto the sidewalk and looked at the house she had grown up in, the house her father had come home to every evening for 30 years, the house where she had learned to read case law at 13 and argued about curfews at 16 and packed for college at 18 with her mother crying in the doorway and her father pretending not to. She had not been inside in 14 months. The distance felt simultaneously like nothing and like everything. "Thank you," she said to Callahan. He nodded, the small contained nod of a man who did not deal in excess. He got back in the car. The taillights disappeared around the corner. Elena and Nora walked up the front path together. The porch steps creaked in the same places they had always creaked. Nora unlocked the door. The hallway smelled the same. Wood polish and the faint, permanent scent of the lavender sachets Nora kept in every closet. The floorboards announced their presence in the familiar language of old houses. The framed photographs on the hallway wall were unchanged. Elena stopped in front of the graduation photograph, her father's hand on her shoulder. The same hand, the same gesture, the same expression he had worn that day in the courthouse hallway when she was 27 and had just dismantled a corporate defense team, and he had looked at her as though she were the finest thing he had ever made. "You stood up," she whispered. "That is what counts." Nora appeared beside her, looked at the photograph, put her arm around her daughter's shoulders. They stood together in the hallway and looked at the face of a man who had believed in justice so completely that it had cost him his life and who would have given it again without hesitation if he could have seen what his daughter had done tonight. "He would have been so proud of you," Nora said. Elena nodded. The tears came again, quieter this time, less violent. The tears of someone processing rather than breaking. She let them come. She was learning after 4 years of swallowing everything to let them come. Nora made tea. They sat at the table, the same table where Elena had eaten breakfast every morning of her childhood, where she had done homework and learned to read case law because her father believed that understanding the law was as fundamental as understanding mathematics. The table where Raymond Prescott had sat on Sunday mornings with his coffee and his crossword puzzle, filling in the answers in pen because he said uncertainty was for pencils and federal judges used ink. They talked, not about the gala, not yet, about smaller things first. The oak tree in the backyard that had lost a limb in a storm, the neighbor's new dog, the book Nora was reading, the careful mundane reconstruction of a relationship that had been severed by a man who understood that isolation was the most effective weapon he possessed. Then gradually, in the way that deep water rises to the surface, not all at once but in slow, steady currents, Elena began to tell her mother what the last 4 years had been, not the evidence, not the financial architecture or the recordings or the forensic reports. Those things would be discussed in courtrooms and newsrooms in the weeks ahead. She told her mother the things that would not appear in any file. The first time Marcus hit her, a Tuesday night in November, 14 months into the marriage. She had asked about a document she found on his desk. The blow came without warning, without escalation, the way a light is switched off. One moment there was light, the next there was not. She had stood in the bathroom afterward, looking at her face in the mirror, trying to reconcile the woman she saw with the woman she had been that morning, and discovering that the distance between those two women was already too large to cross back over. The way he apologized. Perfectly. With exactly the right amount of remorse, and exactly the right promises, and exactly the right tenderness, as though the violence had been an aberration rather than an introduction. She had wanted to believe him, had needed to believe him, because the alternative that she had married a man who would do this to her deliberately and would do it again was a truth she was not yet strong enough to carry. The way it escalated, not in a straight line, in cycles, good weeks followed by bad nights. The slow, systematic erosion of her confidence, her professional identity, her relationships, her ability to trust her own perception of reality. He told her the bruise on her arm was from the doorframe, and she had been so exhausted by the effort of surviving that she almost believed him, even though she had been standing in the middle of the room when it happened. The way he made her leave the law, not by forbidding it, by making it impossible, by calling her clients to express concern about her stability, by contacting her firm's partners to suggest with the most compassionate possible framing that his wife might benefit from a leave of absence. By the time she understood what he had done, her caseload had been redistributed, her office cleared, and the narrative of her breakdown was established fact among people she had spent years building professional relationships with. The isolation from Nora, the most surgical cut of all, because Marcus understood that a mother who loved her daughter was the one relationship he could not control through intimidation. So he controlled it through deception instead, through months of careful, concerned conversations in which he portrayed Elena as fragile, volatile, spiraling. Until Nora, frightened and confused and trusting the man her daughter had married, stepped back, gave space, stopped calling. And Elena, alone in a house with a man who had dismantled every support structure she possessed, had no one left to tell. Nora listened to all of it. She did not interrupt. She did not minimize. She did not defend her own choices or explain her own blindness. She simply sat and listened to her daughter describe 4 years of something she should have seen and did not, and she absorbed every word as though it were a debt she owed and was finally paying. When Elena finished, the room was very quiet. The refrigerator hummed. The clock ticked. Outside the window, the first suggestion of dawn was beginning to lighten the sky above the oak trees. Nora reached across the table and took both of Elena's hands. "I failed you," she said. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were not. "I failed you and I failed your father, and I will spend the rest of my life understanding that. But I am here now, and I am not leaving again." Elena looked at her mother's hands holding hers. The same hands that had bandaged her knees when she was 6, that had adjusted her graduation cap, that had held her father's hand in a photograph on the hallway wall, taken on a day when the future was simple and bright and belonged to all of them. "I know," Elena said. They sat together as the dawn came, light filling the room slowly, the way hope filled a person who had been in the dark for a long time. Not all at once, in increments, in degrees, until the room was bright and the tea was cold, and the new day had arrived, whether they were ready for it or not. The weeks that followed moved at the speed that consequential things move, slowly, methodically, with the specific grinding patience of systems designed to process catastrophe one document at a time. Marcus Hargrove was formally charged on 4 counts of financial fraud, 3 counts of money laundering, 1 count of conspiracy to obstruct justice, and 1 count of murder in the first degree for the death of Judge Raymond Prescott. His lawyer Whitcomb was charged as a co-conspirator. Senator Whitfield was placed under investigation by the Senate Ethics Committee and subsequently by a federal grand jury convened to examine the full scope of regulatory corruption connected to Marcus's legislative activities. The news coverage was extensive. For the first 2 weeks, Elena's face appeared on every screen in the city. The photograph from the gala emerald dress, mascara-streaked face, standing at the microphone with her father's name projected behind her, became the defining image of the story. Journalists called it the most dramatic public exposure of political corruption in a generation. Commentators debated the implications for campaign finance reform, for judicial security, for the systems that had allowed a man like Marcus to operate for a decade without meaningful oversight. Elena did not watch the coverage. She did not read the articles. She did not listen to the commentators who analyzed her speech and her composure and her dress and her marriage with the confident authority of people who had never spent a single night living inside the architecture of control she had survived. She focused on what she could control: the investigation, the testimony, the slow, careful work of rebuilding a life from its foundations. The first morning after the gala, she woke in her childhood bedroom. The ceiling was the same pale blue it had always been. The bookshelf held the same law textbooks she had collected in high school, early editions of constitutional primers and case study compilations that her father had given her one at a time, each one inscribed on the inside cover in his careful handwriting. To Elena, "The law is a living thing. Treat it with respect and it will serve you well. Love, Dad." She lay in the bed and looked at the ceiling and waited for the weight to return. The specific crushing heaviness that had greeted her every morning for 4 years. The dread that preceded opening her eyes, the mental inventory of what Marcus might require of her today, the careful calculation of which version of herself would be safest to present. The weight did not come. In its place was something unfamiliar. A lightness that felt almost dangerous, like standing at the edge of a very high place and discovering that the vertigo was not fear but exhilaration. The disorienting, almost overwhelming realization that today, for the first time in 4 years, nobody was monitoring her phone. Nobody was tracking her location. Nobody was constructing a narrative about her instability while she slept. Nobody was planning to use her signature against her, or her reputation as a weapon, or her father's death as leverage. She was free. The word tasted strange. She said it aloud in the blue bedroom of her childhood, quietly to no one, just to hear how it sounded in a voice that belonged to her. Free. It sounded true. It sounded terrifying. It sounded like the beginning of something she did not yet have a name for. She went downstairs. Nora was making coffee. The radio was on, tuned to the classical station it had been tuned to for as long as Elena could remember. A Chopin nocturne played softly through the small speaker on the counter. The morning light came through the window above the sink and fell across the table in the same pattern it had fallen in every morning of Elena's childhood, And the ordinariness of it, the sheer unspectacular normalcy of a mother and a cup of coffee made Elena stop in the doorway and press her hand to the frame and breathe. Nora looked up, smiled, set a mug on the table. They sat together. They drank coffee. They did not discuss the gala. They discussed what to have for breakfast. And the conversation about eggs and toast and whether there was still jam in the pantry was the most normal conversation Elena had participated in since she could remember, and it filled something inside her that she had not known was empty. She cooperated fully with the federal prosecutors, sat in conference rooms with agents and attorneys, and answered every question with the precision and composure of a woman who had trained for this, not specifically for this moment, but for the discipline of testimony, the architecture of evidence, the patient work of building a case that could withstand scrutiny from every angle. She was, after all, a lawyer. She had always been a lawyer. Marcus had taken the practice from her. He had not taken the skill. The divorce was filed in the second week. It was not contested. Marcus, facing a murder charge and overwhelming evidence of financial fraud, had neither the standing nor the resources to fight it. The proceedings were handled by an attorney whose name Callahan had sent to Elena's phone on the night of the gala, a woman named Pratt who specialized in high-profile cases involving financial abuse and who charged Elena nothing because she had watched the gala footage and decided that some clients were compensation enough. The joint assets were frozen. The shell companies were dismantled. The accounts that had been registered in Elena's name were formally identified as instruments of fraud, and her liability was discharged through a cooperation agreement with the federal investigation. She walked out of the final divorce hearing on a Wednesday afternoon in March. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters. She did not stop, did not make a statement, simply walked through them with the composed, unhurried stride of a woman who had already said everything she needed to say in a ballroom 5 months earlier and saw no reason to say it again. Her mother was waiting at the bottom of the steps. They walked to the car together. Nora drove. Elena sat in the passenger seat and looked out the window at the city moving past and felt something she had not felt in so long that she almost did not recognize it when it arrived. Lightness. The physical, almost disorienting sensation of a person who has been carrying weight for so long that they have forgotten what it feels like to set it down. Her shoulders were lower, her breathing was deeper, her hands rested in her lap without gripping anything, without twisting anything, without the habitual unconscious tension of a body permanently braced for impact. She was light. She was free. And the world seen through the window of her mother's car on an ordinary Wednesday in March looked like a place that might, after everything, still have room for her. In the 4th month, she received a call from a woman named Diane Kessler. Diane was 61 years old. She had been married to a man in city government for 22 years. She had seen the news coverage. She had watched the recordings of Elena's speech on her phone alone at 2 in the morning, playing it over and over, and she had recognized something in Elena's words that she had never heard anyone articulate before. The specific, precise description of what it felt like to be systematically unmade by someone who was supposed to love you. She asked Elena if they could meet. They sat across from each other at a coffee shop near the courthouse. Diane brought a folder of documents she had been collecting quietly for 3 years. Financial records, photographs, a journal she had kept hidden in a storage unit she paid for with cash because her husband monitored every account and every transaction and every mile on her car's odometer. Elena looked at the folder, looked at Diane, and understood something that had not fully formed until that exact moment. There were others. There had always been others. Women sitting in bars and hospital rooms across this city, and every city carrying the same weight, trapped inside the same architecture of control, told the same story about their own instability by the same kind of men. Invisible, isolated, convinced that no one would believe them because the people who were supposed to love them had spent years ensuring that no one would. Elena opened the folder, read the first page, looked up at Diane. "I believe you," she said. 2 words. The 2 words that Diane Kessler had been waiting 3 years to hear from someone who meant them. Diane's composure broke the way Elena's had broken in a ballroom 5 months ago, completely, without reservation, with the full-body relief of a person who had been holding a door closed against a storm and had finally, after years of pressure, found someone willing to help her hold it. Elena sat with her while she cried, said nothing, let it happen. understood from her own experience that this moment was not about comfort. It was about witness, about being seen by someone who recognized what they were looking at. When Diane was ready, Elena said, "I am going to help you." And she meant it with every part of herself that Marcus had tried to destroy and failed. In the months that followed, Elena filed for reinstatement with the Bar Association. The process was deliberate. Marcus's campaign to discredit her had left marks in the professional record that required careful documented correction. Letters of support from colleagues, testimony from partners at her former firm who had been contacted by prosecutors and confronted with evidence that their decision to place Elena on leave had been influenced by deliberate misinformation from her husband. A formal review by the Character and Fitness Committee. She completed every requirement. She did not rush. She did not cut corners. She approached the process the way her father would have approached it, methodically, thoroughly, with respect for the system even when the system was slow. Her reinstatement was approved on a Thursday morning in June. She stood in the hallway outside the review board's offices and held the letter in both hands and read it 3 times. Then she folded it carefully and placed it in her bag and walked out into the sunlight. That afternoon, she opened a legal practice, a small office in a building near the courthouse. 2 rooms, a reception area, secondhand furniture purchased from an estate sale, a window that looked out onto a street where traffic moved and people walked, and the ordinary business of living proceeded at its own pace. She hung her father's photograph on the wall behind her desk. The graduation photograph, his hand on her shoulder. The practice focused on representing victims of domestic abuse in divorce and custody proceedings. Women who could not afford representation. Women whose stories had been distorted by men who controlled them. Women who sat across from Elena in her small office with their folders of hidden evidence and their carefully reconstructed expressions and their specific exhausting fear that no one would believe them. Elena believed them. Everyone. Because she had been them. Because she knew what it cost to sit in that chair and open that folder and trust a stranger with the truth of your life. Because she understood with a precision that no textbook could teach and no continuing education seminar could approximate exactly what these women had survived and exactly what they needed to hear. "I believe you, and then I am going to help you." She won cases, consistently, methodically, with the focused intensity she had brought to constitutional litigation a lifetime ago. Her clients' lives changed. Their children were protected. Their financial autonomy was restored. Their narratives, the false stories their abusers had built around them, were dismantled in courtrooms by a lawyer who knew exactly where the lies were hidden because she had lived inside the same kind of lies herself. Diane Kessler's case was the first. The divorce was filed in July. Diane's husband, confronted with the evidence his wife had been quietly assembling for 3 years, attempted the same strategies that men in his position always attempted. He called her unstable, claimed the documents were fabricated, hired an attorney who specialized in aggressive cross-examination of vulnerable witnesses. Elena demolished every argument. Not with anger, not with the theatrical outrage that some lawyers favored in family court. With evidence, with precision, with the quiet, devastating competence of someone who understood the playbook because she had been the subject of it. The judge ruled in Diane's favor on every count: full custody, equitable distribution of assets, a restraining order that would keep her husband at a legally enforced distance for the foreseeable future. Diane called Elena that evening. She was crying again, but this time the tears were different. They were the tears of a person standing on the other side of something they had been told they would never cross. "Thank you," Diane said. And Elena heard in those 2 words the same inadequacy she had felt when she said them to Dominic outside the ballroom. The specific frustration of a person whose gratitude exceeded the vocabulary available to express it. "You did this," Elena said. "I showed up in a courtroom. You spent 3 years building the evidence that made it possible. You did the hard part alone. I just made sure the room was ready." The words were deliberate. She had learned them from someone who understood that the difference between being saved and saving yourself was not academic. It was the difference between a life rebuilt on someone else's foundation and a life rebuilt on your own. By autumn, Elena had taken on 7 more clients. Her reputation was building quietly but steadily, not through marketing or media appearances. She still avoided the press entirely, but through the powerful invisible network of women who told other women. Who said, "There is a lawyer, she understands. She has been where you are. She will believe you." Go see her. The office expanded. She hired a paralegal, a young woman named Simone, who had graduated from law school the previous spring and who brought to the work the specific fierce energy of someone who had chosen this field not as a career but as a calling. Together, they built case files and prepared motions and sat across from women who had spent years being told their reality was a delusion, and they said the same thing to each one. We believe you, and we are going to prove it. The work was hard. Not the legal complexity, though, that was considerable, but the emotional weight. Each client carried a version of the story that Elena knew intimately. The isolation, the gaslighting, the financial control, the systematic destruction of every support structure. Each time Elena heard it, some part of her recognized it the way the body recognized its own heartbeat. Familiar, permanent, understood at a level deeper than thought. She did not let it break her. She had been broken enough. Instead, she let it fuel her. Let the recognition sharpen her arguments and deepen her preparation and steady her voice in courtrooms where opposing counsel tried to discredit her clients the same way Marcus had discredited her. She knew every tactic. She had survived every tactic, and she dismantled them one by one with the calm, devastating precision of someone who had studied the enemy's playbook from the inside. Her father's photograph watched from the wall behind her desk. Some mornings before the first client arrived, she sat alone in her office and looked at it and spoke to him the way she always had, not asking for guidance, just sharing, telling him about the cases, about the clients, about the small accumulating victories that were taken together, building something larger than any single courtroom outcome. You stood up, she would say to the photograph. And so did I. 8 months after the gala, a Tuesday in October. The evening was cool, carrying the smell of fallen leaves and the first suggestion of winter in the air. The kind of evening that made the city feel smaller, more intimate, as though the dropping temperature had drawn the buildings closer together. Elena walked into Lantern. She had not been back since the morning she delivered the photographs to Callahan. The bar looked the same. Amber lighting, leather booths tucked into shadow. The bartender who refilled glasses without making eye contact. The particular quiet of a room full of people who had come to be alone together. She was not here because she needed to disappear. She was not here because she was running from something or hiding from someone or nursing wounds she could not explain. She was here because she wanted to be, because she had decided consciously and deliberately that the places where she had suffered did not belong to the suffering. They belonged to her. Lantern was where the worst chapter of her life had begun to end. It was also where she had first been seen by someone who chose to act. Both things were true. Both things were hers. She ordered a whiskey, drank some of it, set it down, tasted it rather than using it as a shield. She did not twist a ring. There was no ring to twist. Her left hand was bare, and the groove where the stone had been had long since faded. The skin was smooth, unremarkable. The hand of a woman who had nothing to hide and nothing to prove and nowhere she needed to be except exactly where she was. She looked toward the corner table. Dominic was there. He sat the way he always sat, still, contained. A glass of water in front of him, dark suit, black shirt, the tattoos on his neck disappearing into his collar. His face gave nothing the same economical composure. She remembered the face of a man who had learned that withholding was a form of strength and patience was a form of devotion. But his eyes. When he saw her, something moved in his eyes that his face did not permit. Something warm. Something that had been waiting with the same quiet discipline he applied to everything else. She had not contacted him in 8 months. Not because she did not want to, because she needed to know, needed to prove to herself with absolute certainty that she could stand on her own foundation before she stood beside anyone else. That the strength she had found on the night of the gala was hers permanent and self-sustaining, not borrowed, not dependent on the proclivity of the man who had helped her find it. She needed to arrive here as a complete person, not as someone seeking rescue, not as someone whose gratitude had blurred into something it was not, but as a woman who had rebuilt her life from wreckage and knew exactly who she was and what she wanted and why she wanted it. She crossed the bar, pulled out the chair across from him, sat down without being invited. The same gesture she had made 8 months ago in this same bar at this same table. But everything about the woman making it had changed. The posture was different. The shoulders were back instead of caved inward. The eyes were clear instead of exhausted. The hands rested on the table without gripping, without twisting, without the habitual tension of a body braced for impact. She was not the woman he had carried out of a ballroom. She was the woman who had stood up at the microphone and spoken her father's name and dismantled a corrupt man's empire with evidence and composure and the specific, unbreakable clarity of someone who had finally remembered who she was. Dominic looked at her. She looked at him. "I do not need anyone to save me," she said. "I know," he said. His voice was the same. Low, quiet, the voice that had never needed volume to be understood. A pause, the low music of the bar filled the space between them. Something slow and instrumental that asked nothing of anyone. "But I would like some company," she said. And Dominic Ashford smiled, not broadly, not with the practiced warmth of a man performing an emotion for an audience. A small, quiet shift at the corners of his mouth, barely visible in the amber light. The expression of a man who had been waiting with the patience he applied to everything and who found now that the waiting is over, that it had been worth every single moment of every single day. It was the first time she had seen him smile. She picked up her glass. He picked up his water. They sat across from each other in the amber light of a bar where everything had begun, and they talked. Not about the gala, not about Marcus or the trial or the evidence or the machinery of justice that was still grinding its slow, thorough way through the wreckage of a corrupt man's empire. They talked about other things, books they had read, music they returned to when the day had been long, the particular beauty of autumn in the city, the way the light changed in October, turning everything golden for a few weeks before winter arrived and turned everything honest. The way quiet could be a gift rather than a punishment when shared with the right person. They talked the way two people talked when the hard part was over. And what remains was simply the slow, careful, extraordinary work of building something new in the space where something broken used to be. Outside, the city moved in its ordinary, indifferent way. Traffic and voices and the vast mechanical hum of millions of lives proceeding at their own pace toward their own destinations. A siren somewhere, a bus changing gears, the accumulated sound of a place that had witnessed everything human beings were capable of, the worst and the best, and continued operating regardless. Inside, in a leather booth at the back of a bar called Lantern, a woman who had lost everything and found herself sat across from a man who had seen her at her worst and chosen to stay. Two glasses on the table between them. Two people who understood each other in the way that people who have shared something significant understand each other not through explanation, but through recognition. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, the future did not feel like something Elena Hargrove needed to survive. It felt like something that belonged to her.